I'm just so pleased to see some of you that I haven't seen for minutes. Let me be clear. I am your stereotypical Prius driving, cappuccino drinking leftist professor. I'm the snarky cynic that your favorite radio pundit and enthusiastic youth minister has warned you about. I'm actually what Dr. Thornton refers to in the kinder moments as a squishy liberal. But oddly enough, when I thought about this subject, and this is a subject I've never written on and haven't really given much thought to, when I thought about this subject, I found myself in a strange tone-deaf harmony with him. Many of his positions I agreed with. I agreed with most of them, but I'm not prepared yet to turn in my secular left Fabian socialist gold card. This is because my bleeding heart still pines for Dr. Jendian's view of democracy and diversity. So I suppose you're witnessing my academic midlife crisis. Oh, here we go. There's a joke my father used to tell, and it went something like this. Well, interesting enough, it's kind of like the chicken crossing the road. There's more than one punchline. 3 middle-aged white men walk into a bar. The bartender says, "What is this, an affirmative action debate?" Okay, maybe not. The other alternative punchline is 3 middle-class, middle-aged white men walk into a bar and the bartender says, "There's no joke here." And I feel like that's what we're faced with tonight. That we have a setup with no resolution. Though I only pretend to be psychic, I think I can make a prediction. My colleagues here are going to agree on virtually nothing. Scratch that. They may agree on something. After I finish speaking, they may agree that I have no idea what I'm talking about. And the other thing that they just might agree on is there's a certain amount of absurdity in the air here. Something doesn't feel right in what should be a heavy discussion. It's not that the subject itself is inherently unworthy of academic prodding. It is. Poke at it. Let's see what it does. Although, in my humble opinion, I doubt it'll wake up. It's been slumbering a very long time, and it's not quite as formidable as it was in its youth. This is less Sleeping Giant, more Rip Van Winkle. Also, as a disclaimer, I'll be framing much of what I speak of in terms of the African American experience. I know the debate is much larger, but bear with me. To the point, there's no such thing as affirmative action. Certainly not in California. It's been 20 years since Proposition 209 became law in our state. What was called the California Civil Rights Initiative not only outlawed consideration of race in school admission and public employment, but I might add, gave birth to the act of naming propositions, ironically. Thank you. Yes, these still make it to court once in a while. They still go through the State House. They get on the governor's desk, but with little traction. Polls show little support for anything called affirmative action. But strangely enough, when you simply ask the public about the element of affirmative action without calling it such, they like it. Next, affirmative action. The way affirmative action existed on the eve of Prop 209 yielded very little for those for whom it was designed. For example, in terms of University of California admissions, the most dramatic effect of 209 was not the initial drop in black acceptance rates, which was quite significant, particularly in places like Berkeley and UCLA, but how many students were funneled into universities like Davis and Irvine and Santa Barbara. Black students there graduated at a higher rate than they had before Prop 209. Yet, some will correctly argue that universities find a way around this ban. In admissions, there's been an effort to take in many considerations when looking at students. In employment, colleges have constructed a fail-safe system in order to address race. Here's where I introduced you to a person called the EEO. Cal State system, we have an equal employment opportunity designee. This person sits on job searches to make sure that we play by the rules and everyone gets a fair shot. This sounds great, but it invites trouble. The hiring process has reached the point that now search committees send out emails, send out letters to all sorts of different universities asking for diverse applicants. And this I have no problem with. In fact, I think it's a very good idea. But there's a significant flaw. Think of it this way. Outside of education, the education programs, African Americans constitute less than 5% of all PhDs. The competition for these applicants is brutal. It's an arms race. Fresno State may be bold, but it cannot compete with elite colleges. What do elite colleges offer? They offer their new professors a 2-1 course load, where we teach a 4-4. Fewer students, higher pay, and I dare say it, much better food. Perhaps if we at Fresno State were as serious about this subject, we would use the same logic toward attracting faculty as we do athletes. New turf, new coach, new center, new table. Our new athletic director will know that if we want to compete for the most talented, we've got to pay up. I wonder what our record would be in the classroom. To paraphrase a former president of University of Oklahoma, someday we may have a university our football team can be proud of. There's also a legitimate question about who benefits from race-based preferences. Affirmative action was intended as a legitimate, specific corrective for African Americans. The project has expanded from redress to a social mirror. We want professors to look like our students. Again, this is a noble aspiration in my opinion, but nearly impossible to achieve in the academic's professional lifespan. Also, it begs a lot of interesting questions such as, how is race determined? Who's determining it? Who's in genuine need? Who's authentic? And who just changed their name? On the other side, this mindset also opens the door for what I would call the God and man at Yale types, who claim that real diversity must start with a new crop of young Christian Republicans. Because if you've not heard, they are now a marginalized peoples. Finally, there's the college administration. But that should wait for another day. These are my reservations, but this is my biggest problem with affirmative action. It's simply not enough. It's absurdly insufficient to do more than work as a symbolic measure. As practice where it still can be practiced, it barely moves the needle on the status quo. We need to have a comprehensive system that moves from both the top down, as affirmative action does, and the bottom up. We would see better results. At this point, it is too little and too late. Affirmative action does little to expose our dirty secret in academia called cronyism. Like Ford Pintos, pet rocks and the mullet, I thought cronyism was a thing of the past, and then I got mugged by reality. Now, I don't have the statistics to prove anything, but you can ask us questions. Look in your professor's eyes. Ask him about cronyism. Stare and see if you can sense deceit. It doesn't redress history. It is convenient to pronounce racism dead and claim it's all content of character now. Yeah. Well, it's no longer universally acceptable to engage in overt acts of state-sponsored discrimination. We must acknowledge, as Dr. Jendian did, our shared national past. Outside of a few suburban school districts and the Texas State School Board, there are some facts that historians, American historians, find indisputable. One is History of slavery. Slaves landed before the Pilgrims. Some have argued that we did them a favor, actually. Their lifespan in America, generations later, is longer. They're happier in America. They're not in Africa. So many troubles. And to that I would say, I'll remember your logic when somebody kidnaps your children and takes them to Sweden. Race-based slavery, as a recent book that was panned by The Economist, mind you, race-based slavery is the foundation of American economy and capitalism as we know it. So if you think of it this way, your views of individualism, your views of American freedom are founded upon the institution of slavery, generational slavery. So I suggest you do this. Next time you meet a black man, woman, or child, I want you to say, thank you for your multi-generational sacrifice. Or perhaps better, get a bumper sticker that says, land of the free because of the slave. Now, slavery flourished until the Civil War. Reconstruction, go over Matt Jendian's slides, really don't need to rehash that. Reconstruction was incomplete, underfunded. Jim Crow, not just a word, but a cultural condition for nearly a century. The human cost, not just the economic cost, the human cost, lynching, 3,500 African Americans burned. How are they killed? By mobs, ritually murdered. According to one Mississippi senator, that'd be Senator Theodore Bilbo, he said lynching is not a bad thing. Just always remember to do it the night before an election. There's also the issue of race riots, what we call race riots. You've heard of the Boston Massacre, right? The Boston Massacre was a massacre. Handful of people killed, African American killed. What about Colfax, Louisiana in 1873, 150 killed? Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898, 50 killed. Atlanta, 1906, 40 killed. Chicago, 1919, 25 killed. Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1920. Middle class Tulsa, Oklahoma, what was called the Black Wall Street. Not a bunch of criminals, not a ghetto, but in fact the most prosperous black community in America. Burned to the ground, somewhere between 100 and 300 killed. Rosewood, Florida, a mere 6 killed, but burned at the stake. Well, to the students out there, if this is in fact simply a history as is being taught by 21st century liberals, as we are, how many of you in your History 11 or 12 classes learned about what they call race riots, which were actually massacres? Now, you don't have to answer that question, but you've heard of the Boston Massacre. You've not heard of the 300 people that not only burned out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, but after World War I, we discovered that the airplane did fantastic things. You could drop firebombs on churches, hospitals, and orphanages. So then you have sharecropping and farm tenancy, and this is just something else. It is stolen labor. It's another generation of stolen labor. Housing covenants. Housing covenants, we have these in Fresno. In fact, anybody who lives in the tower, you're still going to have a housing covenant somewhere in your paperwork. And a housing covenant basically says that no one can move in who isn't of a certain race. Armenians weren't allowed to move in for a very long time. The Asians, Latinos, whatever it is, but just most specifically towards African Americans. Housing covenants were deemed illegal in 1920 when the NAACP took it to court. But this is an interesting thing. They're deemed illegal because African Americans have the right to buy property. The caveat on that particular ruling was they can buy the property, they cannot move in. Redlining. Until 1968, it was nearly impossible for African Americans to get bank loans. Matt Jendian talked about the GI Bill's failures. A recent historian wrote a book called The GI Bill. And she basically said that title, which enabled you to get mortgages, which it just didn't really exist for African Americans. The book was not about African Americans. More recently, subprime loans. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, they were all tagged for targeting African American communities for these subprime loans, knowing maybe not exactly what the result would be, but the risk involved. Interesting thing that just came out, you may be amused that a report from Al Jazeera, America, looked at a software called Crosscheck. Crosscheck is the colorblind software that looked at voting fraud. And what it did is it put in names and to see if those names would come up multiple times. And if the names came up multiple times, then we'd say, there's a good possibility that there's going to be voting fraud, and this person voted twice. Well, the names that they used, well, one common name was Jackson. Interestingly enough, African Americans were 45% more likely to be on this list. Though I don't vilify white people, but white Americans were 8% less likely to be on the list. Now, you have to consider how much money changed hands, because what I'm suggesting here is this is not about hurt feelings. This is not about a therapeutic solution. This is about bilking a population and essentially our accountability. I saw a political ad featuring a heroic rancher squatter, Cliven Bundy. He delivers the line quite awkwardly, by the way. And he's standing there and he's with this candidate who's an African-American Tea Party candidate. And he says, quote, "It's almost like black folk think white folk owe them something." Well, my position is white folk do not owe black folk anything. America owes black folks something. To me, this is why affirmative action fails. It's too vague, it's too narrowly applied, it's too conservative. We need more. We need a Marshall Plan, not just for African Americans, but for the location where poverty and race intersect, and that is one damn big intersection. We've had 2 wars, world wars. We've had 2 Gulf Wars. Why don't we try 2 wars on poverty? Or maybe we should wait for Adam Smith's invisible hand, the multiple generations I think Travis was talking about. But what I thought was that invisible hand is a bit more like an iron fist. We need a systematic, well-funded effort from prenatal to employed, not because African Americans are victims, but because it's a down payment on a debt we've never paid. You want to be bold, Mr. Castro? Do not cheapen the word bold by simply applying it to tablets. You'd affect real change, a president. My concern, however, though, is the attack on affirmative action is not a critique of this ineffective system. I see it as a regressive move fueled by the fear of chaotic democracy. I, for one, disagree with Ted Knight's character from Caddyshack, who says to poor young Noonan, "The world needs ditch diggers too." Our world needs informed citizens and real social mobility. I also want to briefly end to remind everyone of the mission of the Cal State system. Remember, this is not an ivory tower. We are not the academic elite. Those people at those places have teaching assistants. They have a handful of students. They have few courses. And they don't enter their architecturally Stalin-esque building praying that the leaky sewage pipe has been fixed. We are state-subsidized professors serving state-subsidized students and charged with training the cops, nurses, and teachers of the next generation. Again, in my opinion, that is a noble cause. We were established to serve this community, brown, black, or white, and not freeze the status quo. We had better figure it out. How are we going to boldly achieve this? And how are we going to move beyond affirmative action? Thank you.